We are really excited to dive into an important discussion entitled Solving the Problems of Tomorrow. Our panel consists of 4 experts. Please welcome Kenna Pitts, founder and CEO at LeadHER International; Catherine Delhaye, co-founder and president of the French non-profit association Le Cercle de la Compliance; Cristian Ducu, the Center for Advanced Research in Management and Applied Ethics; and Andreas Pyrcek, partner in EY's Forensic and Integrity Services practice.
Welcome to you all. Thank you so much for joining me. And Andreas here in the studio with me. You each have very different perspective and different roles within ethics and compliance. And I would like to hear from you first. One of the things that keeps coming up today, and perhaps I'll address this to you first, Andreas, one of the things that keeps coming up today is what exactly is the role of compliance within an organization and where should it be placed? Is that C-suite? Is it second line?
That's a good question, and you're already pointing to the second line. And before we come to the exact question, where should compliance sit and who should lead it, the big question is, what is compliance? Because I think when we take a look at the compliance practitioner, we typically tend to talk about the compliance officer, compliance organization, etc., but there are numerous functions in an organization dealing with compliance. The compliance officer typically deals with risk like bribery and corruption, regulated risk in banks, for example, with KYC, etc., from time to time data privacy. Legal, for example, is also taking a compliance role. For example, in antitrust, we have organizations with data privacy offices. In life science, you have healthcare compliance offices. So a lot of functions who are all in the second line dealing with compliance. So I think at the beginning, it's important to understand what is compliance in my organization, who's taking care of what, who do we align, and who do we report to. And I think it's important to have a proper voice at the board level and being strongly connected to the board in this.
Okay, thank you. Catherine, over to you. You have an association in France, and where do you see compliance based within an organization?
At the very same place it was just described. The reason we set up this association like 10 years ago is exactly for this reason. 10 years back, compliance was not known in France. There was no reason to apply compliance, to respect compliance. Nobody knew about it, actually. We were just like 6 or 7 of us working for American companies at the time. And we knew that this was going the future because we felt how strong and powerful it was. And we decided to create this association, first of all, to train people, to get them to understand what it was all about, to promote compliance, and then to help compliance officers, get the position that they deserve. And 10 years later, I strongly believe, just like you do, sir, that compliance belongs to strategy and to the board level. And this is something that we are working very hard towards in order to help compliance officers get to this level, working together with all of the other stakeholders that you probably referred to when you said that compliance is a big team and a big job.
Okay. Kina, can we get your perspective from the States? Do you see some confusion as to the compliance role? Should it be also together with legal, separate, and where it is in the organization? Is there a different perspective from the States?
Within the United States, you definitely see that separation of roles. You tend to have your legal group as well as your compliance group. But in the most successful organizations, these two are going to still work hand in hand. They're going to be at the table together to make sure that whatever's changing in the landscape, whatever's happening within that entity, that they're covered from both perspectives. And it's important, again, within the United States, some of the trends that we see is that making sure that there is clear definition when you are set up in that 3 lines of defense model, making sure everybody is clear on what their role is within that compliance program. So making sure, are we identifying risks like we should be in the first line? Are we owning those risks? Are we auditing against those risks? Everybody needs to be clear on what that role is within the program.
Thank you, Kina. And Cristian, over to you in Romania. What about your focus is on Eastern Europe? How do you see it from your perspective?
I think the role of the ethics and compliance should be to cover from one top corner to the lowest corner of the organization. Of course, there's a strategic point in this, but there's also a role in changing the business practices at the lowest level, at the level of blue collars, at the level of white collars now, and then to the level of the board when we go back. So I will see the role of ethics and compliance officer all over the organization, not just at the top, at the strategic level.
Okay, so the topic of our panel is a little bit difficult because, of course, no one knows what the future holds. But we can look at a recent development, the corona pandemic. And, of course, that was not completely predictable as it was, but we knew that a pandemic was coming. So how do you respond best to a rapidly changing world? Perhaps, Andreas, you can start with this question with the specific scenario of the corona pandemic. What do you see there as the best way to respond to such a development?
Yeah, I think the pandemic was really challenging because also for the compliance department, it was something they haven't really experienced before. They typically tend to do the risk assessments in regards to their specific risks. And Corona and COVID the expectation was that enterprise risk management is taking care of that, even though it hasn't. Because no one really experienced such a situation before. Anyhow, when COVID kicked in with all the lockdowns and the transformation then to working from home, it was an extreme challenge also for the compliance organization. So it was the first time where compliance department had to respond to immediate external effect, which affects the whole business and the whole operating model, and also the operating model for compliance. So compliance in future and looking ahead, solving the problems of tomorrow, have to think bigger. And coming back actually to the question before, first of all, who's responsible for what? And secondly, how are we more aware of what's coming up? It can be an external effect, like a sustainability item, something happening in the environment, health topic like COVID, but also upcoming regulation where organizations need to stay close to the sector, where a sector is developing in, to what is the regulator intending to do? Is he keeping quiet, or are there already indications that regulation is coming up? So this is really important that organizations and compliance officers are opening their views, opening discussions with peers, with regulators, etc., to see what is coming in future.
Okay. Catherine, you have a very global perspective. You've worked in many different countries as a compliance and data officer. Which would you say were the companies from a compliance perspective that were best set up to deal with the corona pandemic?
I think that compliance is the perfect methodology to approach this kind of issue. And even those who had not been dealing with matters different from, antitrust, anti-bribery, the usual suspects, were prepared to address this kind of issue. So, of course, the American companies were way ahead of the game, but others who are stepping up and who are now well versed into compliance are prepared. I think, as we just said, Andreas, it's a matter of open mindset. If you're open, if you're willing to learn, if you are very convinced of your methodology, and if you can work in team with other experts, you can apply your methodology and really bring something to your company. So which were the best? I think those who are very confident in their technique. I mean, compliance in a way is a technique and a risk management approach. And I think everyone was ready. The only thing is that I'm not sure all of the compliance officers thought of getting involved into it. And this is probably those who made a difference, those who stepped up and decided that they would have a role to play and something to bring to the game.
Andreas, I think you'd like to add something to that?
Yeah, perfect. I think this is really perfect, and we can easily take the information we received this morning in the keynotes where compliance is changing with the ethics component, etc. When it comes to the compliance officer and anticipating what's happening in future, the compliance officer also has to understand that compliance is not a desktop exercise, that you're sitting there reading regulation, upcoming regulation, etc. You have to talk to the people. Most information actually is within your business. They anticipate what's happening in operations, etc. And when you talk to them as compliance officer, you typically get a lot of information which helps you as compliance professional dealing with potential risks in future.
Okay. Kina, Catherine mentioned that she says American companies seem to be better set up in their compliance roles for something like the corona pandemic. How do you see that?
I agree. I think that there were definitely some advantages in the American setups and the compliance program, but what I find, wouldn't be unique to any country is those who already had an established culture of learning. They were already training their people to think. They were already involved in getting, making sure they were abreast of the changing regulations, the changing climate, reading things other than our typical regs and all of the laws and ethics books and things like that. Those who really had their, we'll say, ear to the street, who were really looking for trends to see what's happening in our society, those are the ones who were really in a position to be able to pivot, if you will, to take on all of the challenges and complexities that came with the coronavirus pandemic. Also, those that had teams that were agile in their processes, that didn't have to have a lot of changes in terms of their management and bureaucracy and how to respond to their changing customer needs. Those were also going to be some of the organizations that had the better successes. And of course, the collaboration between the different lines of defense, talking to the people in your operations, talking to your first line, those who have direct connection with your customers, your consumers. Those organizations were able to use those advantages. They already had those open lines of communication to be able to understand what's needed from us at this time to be able to service our customers.
Okay. One of the things that, of course, we are focusing on is the risk landscape and how what could be possibly coming up. Cristian, from your perspective, what are the changing risk? What's changing in the risk landscape?
I think there are some new topics in not only related to the pandemic and how we work from remote areas, but I think there are some topics related to immigration, to climate change, to innovation in our field. For instance, today we heard about artificial intelligence. How can we use in a purposeful way artificial intelligence in ethics and compliance? And also, how biased are the automation processes when we deal, for instance, with data sets related to beneficial owners? For instance, I have seen quite impressive biases when dealing with companies that are owned by, for instance, Russians. But there's also something that we will need to address in the future. And this is the deficit of professional advanced skills in ethics and compliance. I heard our esteemed colleagues talking about ethics and how ethics this new ethics trend is changing the ethics and compliance. I would disagree with you. I know this field since 2006, 2007, and historically, it was all the time related to ethics. In 1978, when FCPA was adopted, F77 and entered into force in 78, it was a matter of ethics. It was dealt as a matter of business ethics, and it evolved as a matter of ethics and compliance. And the legislation from the US was talking about ethics programs, not compliance programs. It changed a little bit over time. What we see now is that we are trying to put together pieces in a puzzle. After we broke that puzzle, just flushed it in the air as a result of various scandals. And we forgot about the ethical business patterns, and now we realize that is very important to us. I also think that a huge challenge in the risk in the risk portfolio, if you want, it will be the political risk. We'll have to take into consideration the political risk, not only in the classic way we understand political risk as geopolitical risk, but as a matter of influences from within our countries, where populists can change the legislation overnight, and you end up with your business up in the air. Remember Hugo Chavez and how he did the privatization of certain U.S. companies.
Okay, this is perhaps
others.
a good point to ask Kina. Do you see political risk as a risk in the compliance landscape up ahead?
Absolutely. There's already been calls in the U.S. to enact legislation that requires greater transparency around political donations, lobbying, advocacy efforts. There's already that outcry, especially considering the events that happened in the United States on January 6th with the attack on the U.S. Capitol. The events that unfolded after that and other similar events, people have identified several of their congresspeople were involved in that. Several of their local legislators, their community officers, their commissioners, these people were there. And so understanding, what happened there at the Capitol and understanding that these are your elected officials who are participating in such a mutiny, there's already that outcry to enact legislation to put that into question so that people are understanding where are dollars going. If I'm contributing to a political action committee through my employer, where are my dollars going? What are we lobbying for? And why is that? And do our company values, do my values as an employee align with where those dollars and cents are going? So we're definitely starting to see more of a roar there. There's always been that need for transparency, but in the months of this year, that's become more realized.
Andreas, for you, any other aspects of risk that are changing?
Yes, I think there are three aspects which we can cover here. First of all, let's talk a little about technology. And with technology, I mean certain changes happening in an organization which also affects compliance. So I think during the pandemic, we all experienced that we have to think about new business models. I mean, all the tool providers which are now active on the market operated very efficiently in implementing new tools which are able for customers, but also in the B2B environment, companies established new technology solutions which they brought into the market, which actually also caused new emerging compliance risks. Because with new products, you potentially have to comply to other regulatory as before. Secondly, with digital, organizations transformed. From manual processes, they transformed to digital procedures, workflow management, etc., with the risk that certain procedures and controls are actually not effective anymore. So another emerging risk for a compliance officer taking care, what's really happening now in the transformation from manual to digital procedures. With that, also new emerging regulation came up and new discussion about regulation. We covered the AI Ethics Act, which is under development in the European Union, environmental, social governance topics. Also antitrust and merger control was a big topic. How big can tech be while we are working in a pandemic, for example? Risks which have been super focused prior to the pandemic, but now more and more emerging. Secondly, surely the changing environment of regulations, which is coming up with the whistleblower directive, other regulation, the ESG campaigns, which are now going from country to country and also changing the scope of compliance. And thirdly, also, I have to say a little bit the pressure on compliance itself. So what is compliance being in charge for? How effective is compliance? And how efficient should compliance be? And how should compliance transform to manage better risks? Also with digital solutions, with new governance models, etc. So I think the perspective of technology, regulation, and the compliance organization itself are the effects how to manage risk properly.
Okay. Catherine, your association wants to promote compliance in France, but let's look at it from the other perspective, that businesses want to grow and they want to be agile and they want to make profit. And they often see compliance and ethics as an obstruction. How do you go about that challenge? Because that is, from your point of view, one of the things that you are promoting, the compliance and how to bring that across.
You're right. This is something that the French, at least the French and probably many Europeans, had to overcome. Because in the beginning, compliance was seen as something completely awkward, unheard of, that the legal community would tend to disregard and not really appreciate because they saw it as something that was either American or unusual, and it was not very welcome. Plus, what you said before, that this was very much related to ethics, and ethics doesn't mean much here. So we had to overcome this first barrier. Second, we went into a period where compliance became mandatory. Because in France, for instance, of the Sapin 2 law, which is the anti-bribery law, which forced companies to implement compliance programs. So it was brutal, violent to those who had never heard of compliance and who had from one day to the other to implement these pillars and these rules and these programs, etc. Nobody understood anything, and it took a couple of years to land. And I think that now we are at a point where people are really starting to step up. We see new generations, people who are trained to become compliance officers, or people who are back from the US or other culture where they learned a little bit of it, instead of having people where we did not know what to do with and they ended up being compliance officer. So there is a radical shift here. And little by little, people are progressing. The compliance community is developing and now in a better position to sell compliance, to explain it. The business associations have done a great job in explaining that this is it, we have to go through it. Companies should stop resisting and should embrace it as some kind of an added value, something that big companies will look into and that we have to go for. So little by little, I think that compliance officers are trying to become business partners. Business people are trying to see compliance officers as support, help, adding value instead of seeing them as the enemy. And, little by little, people are converging, I think, for the benefit of the business. But it's a long journey.
Cristian, from your perspective, you're the founder of the European Ethics and Compliance Association based in Bucharest with a focus on Eastern Europe. What do you see as the obstacles to accepting a compliance program in Eastern Europe?
First of all, I think we still have to do a lot of management education. We have a deficit in management skills in Eastern Europe. We see all the highest level of Eastern European companies, expats from various countries, but we don't see enough local managers. And because of that, we see an influx of new ideas from Central and West Europe, from the US, but with no dialogue with the local future managers or even current managers, mid-level managers. And this is something that we have to overcome. It's not something common only in Eastern Europe, but also in North Africa. We have to invest more in their training. And also we have to invest more in training the students from economics. We have to bring them, and students from law schools, we have to bring them in the same boat. We have to make them aware of what it really means compliance and how they can help organizations in the future. And I wanted to mention organizations, not only companies, because in some cases we in Eastern Europe, we discuss about ethics and compliance in the public sector more and more. And we have to look how ethics and compliance were adopted in the public sector, because we can learn a lot from there. And not as a, let's say, not with a driver from the regulators, but also, from the civil society. The civil society created a pressure to force public institution to take into consideration the ethical aspects. Of course, the regulators were important, and they came after that. But organizations like Transparency International, for instance, pushed the regulators, the officials, to take into consideration ethics in a more institutionalized way. This is something that we have to learn. And one more aspect that I want to mention here is that I said that we have a deficit of advanced ethics and compliance skills. How do we push forward the literature in this field? Because a lot of people complain that we don't have enough literature. We don't have enough studies. Today, someone asked, can you show us the studies that support the idea the ethical behavior is related directly with the better performance of organization? I studied this topic for over 10 years, and I know the literature, and this connection is not so strong as we would like to be. Not in the scientific or, let's say, academic papers, probably in our public discourses, but we have to make more efforts to support studies that are done not in an academic environment, but in our organizations. Not too many companies are open to research.
Okay, Cristian, let's just hold that point for a second, because I think Andreas would like to add something to that.
Cristian, that's perfect. And I think to add on this, it's really challenging. What is the expectation in regards to the compliance office? What should it deliver for the business? I think we all here in the panel discussion, we have 10 years plus experience and have seen the development from a very legal-driven compliance program now to more a holistic view on compliance. And I think the expectation of management, of first line, is that the compliance officer is well trained in legal topics, in business ethics, understanding technology, understanding people and psychology. So technically, a compliance officer should do everything to protect the firm. And honestly, it's not possible. And even when you go back to academia, to universities, etc., they can train just the baseline. I agree with you, Cristian, what you're saying. We also have to start there, training also the legal profession, what is important for business, the business profession, what is important when it comes to legal compliance, etc. But the main challenge also looking forward is what is the real expectation for compliance? Because my impression is that business and executives expect much more than compliance is delivering today.
Okay, well, let's look at skill sets then, look into the future. Are compliance professionals well prepared for future challenges, or what are the skill sets that you think should be coming in, new ones?
Yeah, looking at various compliance departments, and I've seen a lot during my career as consultant, every compliance department has its strengths and weaknesses. So you see very legal-driven compliance departments with very strong policies, etc., very strong enforcement, whistleblowing mechanisms. You see other ones which are more behavioral-driven, where you need more structure, etc., and also more the legal background with more interaction with the legal department. And this is bring us back to your question: how should a legal or a compliance profession develop, train, learn, etc.? And I think it's not only about the learning. I think every compliance department needs to attend those kind of conferences to learn what's happening, what's new in regulation, etc. But what I also think is important is the peer network, talking to other firms in compliance and ethics, also to non-peers from other sectors. For example, learning from when you are in just regular industry, learning from life science or financial services. They have very different views on various risks, where you can share, collaborate, learn how they are doing, talk to the people, and being very, very open-minded to develop yourself.
Okay, thank you. Catherine, more specifically, which skill sets do you think compliance and ethics professionals should be looking to expand on to face the problems coming?
Well, with my association, we've been working very hard over the past 6 months on determining what the skills that a compliance office should have. And we divided them into 3 categories: the legal skills, whether compliance officers do have them or have lawyers within the team or on the team, compliance skills, what it takes to be a good compliance officer, and all of the techniques that need to be known, how to conduct a risk mapping, how to set up a training program, how to, all of this. And what we call the soft skills, which include the ability to lead, to talk, to convince without putting too much pressure while being still very firm. It has to do also with sharing experience, lessons learned. It has to do with convincing a board, being able to talk to very different people. So leadership is absolutely fundamental. And to be able to be the conductor who runs all these, you need ground management skills. Absolutely. And so we believe that it's really a combination of all of those, but business skills, technological skills, not to be a project manager or an IT guy, but to be able to understand which system to choose or which AI to use. So it's a combination of skills, but what we believe is that it cannot be a one-man show only. It's a combination of skills, and our recommendation and belief in this association is that we should look at it from the group, the compliance group perspective, not only from the individual. So it's a lot of skills that we're talking about, but combined.
Okay, thank you. Cristian, I see you nodding. You are very involved in training. What skill sets would you like to discuss?
Actually, I wanted to point here something very important. Many companies try to push in the profile of the ethics and compliance officer a lot of directions. For instance, you see that you have a legal manager that is also responsible for the compliance function and also data protection and maybe some aspects related to sustainability. This is the worst scenario when you have one person responsible for everything that is related to ethics and compliance or regulatory in general and whatever. I think we have to look at this function more in a more diverse way. For instance, you have people with background in psychology and philosophy, for instance, if you want to talk about ethics, organizational behavior, and so forth. If you need someone who is trained in regulatory compliance, then you have someone specialized in regulatory compliance. So we need to look at a department with people that have different backgrounds, not just one person. And also, besides the basic skills that we all should have, like negotiation, public communication, and many other things, we have to invest more in specialization. We need to talk more about how a person has the skills to address an issue from various directions. For instance, if he has a new regulatory act, then he has to know not only how to read that act, but also how to create a procedure, an internal procedure, how he can put into practice that procedure, how to interact with people, to change the business pattern in that organization. So there are many things that are involved in ethics and compliance, just as Catherine said.
Thank you, Cristian. Kina, I see you nodding as well. So what do you see as the key skill sets that compliance and ethics professionals should be looking to expand on?
Right. I agree with all of my colleagues. It definitely is not just one thing. You're talking about needing to build a group, a team to be able to have all of those skills. One thing that I've noted when I'm working with compliance officers, especially in terms of training, is not just the communication skills to be able to speak professionally, convince boards and leaders, but also to listen. I have worked with compliance officers who could tell you their act or regulation verbatim, but didn't understand how to apply it to the business because they didn't understand the business, the products, the services, whatever it is that you're selling or doing. And so it's important that we have compliance officers who can listen to their business partners so that they can understand the nature of what that business is to be able to apply the regs, but also to be able to critically think, interpret, and apply those regulations. And that way you can partner with your business partners to be able to move that business forward or change the trajectory of what that business is doing or to eradicate bad behaviors if that's what's happening. But compliance officers need to be able to listen, to think, and then also just effective problem solving. I think if nothing else, the pandemic has really shown us that we have to be able to think on our feet, very agile, and be able to move quickly with the changing regulations and the needs of our customers. So we definitely need to communicate, need to listen, need to be able to think critically and be creative where you have to fill in those gaps.
Okay. Andreas, a specific skill set of being technology savvy, because we've seen a huge increase in data and the amount of data and stuff. Yeah. Is a technology skill set important, do you think, looking into the future?
I think it's important to have a general understanding what's happening within the organization and how you can be more efficient in the compliance department. Technically, as also all the participants were saying, the chief compliance officer do not really have to be an expert in technology. I mean, he cannot be an expert for everything in the organization, but he should have a general understanding where potential risk in business is arising due to technology. So where are we using AI and talking to the right people? What are you technically doing there? Can you explain it a little bit to me? And then surely he has, like you are saying, the team who can look a little bit more deeper in this one and interact with the first line. And secondly, evaluating how can I do my compliance department with technology better. He doesn't really have to be an expert, but taking this step by step, how can I improve? And this takes time. I think expecting that the compliance office should be an expert in technology is the wrong way, but he should be aware of what's going on around him.
Okay, one of the things that, Cristian, you mentioned is that there's too much expected from the compliance and ethics professionals, but a huge organization has a huge budget for the compliance program. Smaller organizations are limited, so the compliance professional needs to be able to do more.
Yes, sure, they need to do more. For smaller organizations, they more have to collaborate, because typically you rely on the first line. Let's think about an AI solution which is developed in the organization, which A, is getting soon regulated, secondly, can cause ethical risks, compliance risks, while transforming that. The compliance officer needs to have a fruitful conversation with the software developer. What is he doing? Where can these risks arise? And then on a collaborative level, actually evaluate what is the impact for the organization. He doesn't really have to be the expert, because I think while you collaborate with the first line and bring other ones in the team to evaluate that, you can lift up the potential and evaluating the risks. In large organizations, you have the data privacy officer, you have a technology compliance, however they call it. You have experts who can really dig into this one and dealing with the first line. There you have the budget to do that.
Okay. Cristian, what would you advise smaller companies with less resources? How can they best prepare in their compliance role? Because you were saying they expect too much from the compliance officer, but what else can they do?
I think they have to prioritize, and prioritizing ethics and compliance is something related directly to their safety of the profits, if you want to call it this way. If you really want to protect your company, you have to invest even a small amount of money. And in some cases, it means that part of your compliance function can be optimized and you have to pay a company to create the automation for that. Or in other cases, all you have to do is to buy a solution that already exists. Or you can pay external consultants to come and help you with a specific issue that you are confronting with. Or the training you can outsource to an organization that is specialized in this. And sometimes with not so much money that we think of, not big budgets. But what I would like to see is also more collaboration with our peers. In many cases, the networks of professionals can help you in ways that you never thought of. They can help you, for instance, to see how a certain procedure should look like, or how the let's say a specific official document should be filled in, or how the Whistleblower Transposition Act should be interpreted. So you have to be connected as an ethics and compliance officer, and you as a manager, you have to give the capability of your ethics and compliance officer to do that. In many cases, these people are overwhelmed with tasks that can be easily put into a tech solution and automated.
Okay. Catherine, how do you prepare for the unpredictable?
Oh. Well, I think that we are trying to always stay ahead of the legislation and regulation, which doesn't protect us from the unpredictable, but at least we are trying to anticipate as much as we can. And one of the key activities of our association is indeed to bring the speakers from all over the place who are aware of what's going on and can help compliance officers, one, to better understand certain topics, but also to be aware of what's upcoming so that they can prepare. Now, as you said, compliance officers have limited resources, limited budget, because in some companies, budgets are huge, but this is not always the case. Remember that we are still under some cultures where compliance is a must, but not something welcome nor happily budgeted for, no resource for. So it's very complicated, and it's a real challenge to be the conductor, as I said before. And I fully agree with you, Cristian, that solidarity, sharing lessons learned, etc., is also a good way of preparing, because you can share expertise, experience, and learn from it. But to me, the best way to anticipate is really to stay at the front edge of the regulation and what's upcoming. And also, you mentioned geopolitics, and I fully agree with this, because compliance officers here in Europe had to deal with the sanctions. I mean, Iran and all the rest of it, and we were hoping that this would calm down, but it did not, because it changed. And so we always have to anticipate what is going to happen here in the world or there in the world. We also have all of these society matters, like the Uyghurs popped up like a year or two ago, whereas nobody knew about the Uyghur, and certainly not in the compliance area. So I think it's very important that we know the regulation, but we look at what's going on around the world, and that the associations, help compliance officers. I don't see any other way, maybe a crystal ball, but that's it.
Okay, well, good topic here, globalization. Companies that want to increase their globalization. What would you recommend to them? I mean, there are different perspectives on compliance in different countries. So how best to deal with that?
Yeah, that's a challenging question, because especially when we from EY deal with global clients, we deal with different cultures. And the ultimate goal of the compliance and ethics office to protect the firm, protect the employees, and setting a certain framework in an organization which is explaining these are more the corporate binding rules, policies, procedures, training, etc. But when you roll out those kind of program, let's say from France to China, to the Middle East, to Japan, or to Brazil, you are confronted with different cultures, different mindsets, different ways how to work. I think one of the best example is dealing with conflicts, conflict of interest, management styles in organizations. When you roll out collaborative systems to China, where you have a very strong supervisor employee level, it's different. So you need a certain baseline in your compliance program saying this is what we absolutely expect from everyone. These are our common values outlined in the code of conduct. These are our global policies. But then it's really a transformating challenge. Say these are the corporate binding rules in our compliance program. When you go to Middle East, how to explain this in this region that it's important and relevant for their own business context, that they understand what is okay and what is not, and how is this applicable in their day-to-day business. And this is the really challenging part of the compliance officer. So the compliance office has to understand different cultures, how something coming from headquarters is arriving actually in the respective country. And at the end, the compliance officer has to make the program effective. So this is one of the very, very challenging pieces. So you have to understand how something that's coming from corporate is influencing a country.
Okay, I'd like to put the cultural question to Kina, because you're based in the States, and so States is huge, very culturally diverse. How do you perceive those problems within your role?
One thing that we have to focus on here is making sure our compliance officers that we're helping to prepare our businesses to also understand the culture. It's important to be able to frame your common values so that when you are expanding globally and you are doing business in anything out of the US footprint, those companies, that you understand how to communicate and that you understand how to make things very transparent, that you're following not only the national laws, but you're following the statutes, the vision, the values of your particular company. So we do see that more and more, of course, the expansion of businesses in a global perspective, but it's definitely necessary to focus on the culture of where you are in understanding those differences and preparing our compliance officers with training, diversity, and that's also important as we spread out more globally, and understanding what that means in that particular culture.
Okay, one final question, which I'd like to put to all of you. Andreas, I'll start with you. How do you measure success? How do you know that you've completed your compliance vision?
Yeah, the measurement of compliance and ethics is challenging. We had this morning already in the keynotes. How do you measure the ethics program? Typically, you do this through the surveys and seeing how actually employees react while you are asking them compliance questions. It's also the feedback cycle you receive from employees, whether they appreciate your support. How are participation rates? How is the feedback of the board? Are they interested in that, or is it just a tick in the box? So there are various components. You cannot really, from my perspective, and I mean, this question is asked numerous times, how do you measure effectiveness of the program? It's not about the tick in the box and seeing whether controls are being complied with. It's the cultural piece, and this is where you can only measure success. Are the people understanding it? Are they convinced that this is the right thing to do? Is compliance supportive? And I think talking to the people, getting impressions is the best thing to see whether it's in the hearts and minds of the employees.
Okay. Kina, how do you measure success? Are there any other factors that you're looking to?
We look into programs to see, have we moved away from trigger events? Are we more forward thinking with our compliance practices in our programs? We're typically triggered by something that happens in terms of regulation or an examination from one of our regulators. But of course, that's really not enough. You want to be able to be forward thinking. So those internal metrics, what events are we mitigating? Has something come up within the business model that we can say we already have a solution for that and we're ready to mobilize that solution? Have we invested in our compliance professionals to be more agile, more well-rounded? And can we really take a step back and objectively look at our business model to determine, have we interwoven all of these practices, ESG, sustainability, ethics, are these part of the business model? Or are we looking at it from a checkbox perspective?
Okay, thank you, Kina. Cristian, that's something you mentioned, trying to make companies understand, like if they've got a fine, okay, that wasn't though a complete disaster because actually we were very successful in X, Y, Z. Anything else you'd like to add to measuring success and how to get that across as well?
I think there are multiple ways. All of them are good in themselves, but they should be treated together. What Kina said, what Andreas said, we should also look at the ethical climate. We heard today how we can measure the ethical culture, but I would say, how can we measure the ethical climate? Did we improve our ethical climate? Did the ethical climate change from yesterday to today? Also, we have to look at the number of incidents in our organization. How many employees reported certain types of behaviors, and if that type of behavior changed after we did something in particular to address it. We also have to look at the fines that we received or we didn't receive. We mitigated those situations. We also have to look at how others perceive us. Words like you will word today are important, but I think looking at our external stakeholders is very important to see how they perceive the organization, how they perceive our business practices, how they perceive the behavior of our employees in particular.
Okay, Catherine, you're nodding. Would you like to add to that, how you perceive the success factor of a compliance program?
I found the third party's perspective very interesting. I think that success is measured by, first of all, the fact that people understand the programs, adhere to the program, take ownership of it. And I think we can measure it through the level and the quality of the questions that are being asked. The more our phone rings, the better I feel. I also like the fact that the whistleblowing system works, because I think that it's healthy to have a vivid whistleblowing system. And at the same time, I agree with you, Cristian, that not getting fined is a very important signal. So all in all, I think it has to do with ownership, with trust, with questioning, with the fact that compliance becomes part of the culture. You know, it's not like in the beginning, 10 years ago, there was this kind of strange compliance department sitting in the 8th floor together with the C-suite, maybe, or at the back end of the legal department or somewhere. And now these people have turned into active business partners, contributing to safe and healthy business development. So the image, the reputation, the perspective, the perception of the compliance office, plus the way people behave. And last but not least, of course, the board and the chairman or CEO, the way he or she talks to compliance or about compliance. I think that all of these factors reflect some kind of success.
Okay, thank you. We have a question from one of the ECEC community viewers here. Ivona Adamczyk, thank you for sending in your question. Now, I don't know if any of you have experience with a family-owned business, because her question is how to convince the board in a family business that they need a compliance program. The company is growing every day, and now they employ over 1,000 employees all over the world, but they still don't understand how important compliance is. Who would like to answer? Cristian.
I would like to say a couple of things, just brief remarks. It depends a lot on how you interact with those members of the board, how open they are to arguments, and also it depends how good you are at negotiating things. And I think that in some cases you have to put it in a very personal way. Members of the board might be liable in certain situations, especially in this type of companies. You have to show them exactly what would happen if the ethics and compliance function is not well prepared to mitigate problematic situation. In other cases, it might work a more critical way, showing how employees may affect the interests of the company. Or you can also express points related to how unethical behavior in general affects the ability of the company to attract investors, to attract new business partners. There are many potential ways of convincing the member of the board, but it all depends on the context and how good you are in presenting the issue.
Okay, thank you, Cristian. Another question from Nike Costa. Thank you for adding your question. What would you call the #1 challenge of the future, Andreas? Number one.
Anticipating risks and what's coming up. And also the risk alignment combined with this. I think compliance is getting more complex. It's faster. So you have to anticipate more, you have to have a more broader view on compliance. I think that's a major challenge for compliance officers to keep this pace, to understand what's happening in the business, what's happening with regulation, who's doing what in an organization. I think that's the #1 for the compliance officer.
When we had our call, you mentioned specifically with new technologies, staying one step ahead of the regulators, knowing what the risks could be even before the regulation is there, right?
Exactly. Anticipating what's coming up and knowing actually what will affect the organization to be prepared.
Okay. Katrien, Cristian, Kina, would you like to add anything to the #1 challenge of the future?
Yeah, no, I think I agree with you. It's really understanding that compliance is not only risk management, but this is something strategic that we need to be able to talk to and that we need to be able to discuss with the C-suite. So I think that the next challenge is really to step up and to use to get into the position that compliance officers deserve, and compliance deserves.
Okay, we have another question from Mary Fowler. Can any of you advise regarding ethics and compliance in the religious sector? So many church denominations fail to realize that charities too must adhere to the laws governing compliance. Kina, would you like to answer this one?
That's a hot topic in the United States, I'll say that, with more regulation coming for non-governmental organizations, churches, charities, all of that. There's definitely a need for those entities to be educated that there are compliance and ethical regulation expectations required of them. And again, I think even as Cristian put it, it's really going to be, how influential you are to that organization to have that conversation. You're going to need to be able to, pose that question or present that need in a pretty personal way. When you're talking about church and religion, I don't know how much more personal you can be when you're talking about matters of faith. So it's really going to depend who's going to be the person to meet with that priest or the executive director or whoever is considered the head of that organization to really be able to make that case. But there definitely are ramifications of those compliance and ethical programs, having one or not.
Okay, I think there was another question, if we could have a look at that, from Rebecca Schmidt. Just from my memory, there was a lot of talk about the younger generation today. It came up a couple of times. How do you bridge that gap for the younger generation in compliance topics? I think that was the question. I can't see it right now, but...
I can take this one.
Thank you.
So, I think we talked a little bit about the skill set of the compliance officer, and we talked about communications and understanding who are we talking to. I think one big piece of the day-to-day compliance work of the compliance officer is selling a product which is not optional. Honestly, you have to buy compliance, but you have to sell it in a way where the buyer is saying, okay, I get it, and I really like it. And we've seen an instance in the past that policies are being circulated, you're being invited to 2 hours online trainings or in-person trainings for 4 hours. When you now think from a marketing perspective and selling your product, would this actually attract young people? Likely no. So they are consuming in different way, the Facebook generation, etc., screening through the policy. We've heard this morning the rule book with Adam Carven, for example, new ways how to distribute certain information, collect information. And I think it's important to understand how do young people understand and consume information, how do they learn, and how do we as compliance officer transform our mandatory information in a way that they
Bless you.
buy it.
Sorry.
Okay, thank you. Cristian, would you like to add to that?
Yes, contrary to the general opinion, our field is very conservative regarding attracting the profile of the new generation. I mean, we tend to attract people that have the same profile as us. But the new generations, those that will be in our field in 5-10 years from now, have different ethos, have different generational profile. They are, I don't want to say too much about their ethical profile, let's say, but I think they are more lax when it comes to regulations, but they are more conservative when it comes to hot topics like climate change, human rights, and many other things. And we have to take this into consideration because they will be more sensitive to this type of approach. And we also have to be more careful when we attract new talents in our field. And we have to take into consideration that they should not have necessarily our profile, but we have to adapt to what is coming.
Great. Thank you very much, Cristian. I have to stop there because we've come to the next point in the program. Otherwise, we have run out of time. Thank you so much, Catherine, Kina, Cristian, for joining us from abroad. Andreas, thank you for joining me here in the studio and for sharing your valuable knowledge.